Guys, good morning and welcome to the podcast. My name is Andy. I'm the clinical lead here at Redicare. In today's session, what we're going to talk about is a little bit of a thought experiment, but also looking at the science behind the idea that you might be able to cure or at least vastly improve depression with diet by changing your diet. So initially, when I started to look at this topic, I thought, well, there'd be some connection. We know there's a connection between what you eat and your mental health, and that your gut microbiome is connected to the brain and so on. And then I went deeper into it and started looking at the idea that ultimately the vast majority of the symptoms of mental illness, so depression, anxiety, ADHD, bipolar, schizophrenia, and so on, are essentially just manifestations of a problem with your brain energy metabolism. So the part of the cell that we refer to as the powerhouse of the cell that's important for your brain is your mitochondria. And it's emerged in the literature. There's been a theory emerging, the metabolic psychiatry, that at the root cause of most mental illness is essentially mitochondrial disturbances. Now, when we look at mental illnesses, we would say that there is understandable symptoms of mental illness, and then there are ones that are kind of can't be explained. So what we call idiopathic, no clear cause. So essentially, if we look at, say, for example, depression, okay, your mom died 3 or 4 weeks ago, months ago, last year, whatever. It's understandable that you would have situational depression. You think your house is going to get repossessed next Tuesday. It's understandable that you would have anxiety. But in the absence of a clear environmental trigger like those, mental illness that can't be explained by any obvious trigger, you shouldn't by anyone else's, at least, you don't have any clear reason why you would be depressed or have anxiety. And obviously schizophrenia and bipolar, there's no reason why you should have schizophrenia or bipolar. In the absence of those clear environmental triggers, that it appears, there's a ton of literature supporting this as well, that the vast majority of those mental illnesses, including depression, including anxiety, are a mitochondrial or energy production issue. And we'll speak about what can damage your mitochondria. But first, I want to look at the connection between high blood sugar levels, which is the ultimate insult to your energy production, teaching the body to run on glucose and sugar all the time, and essentially your body becoming kind of not good anymore at dealing with sugar and carbohydrate. And remember, all carbohydrate boils down into sugar. And the impact that that has on your chances of becoming mentally ill. Let me just share a screen here for one moment. Okay. So if we look at, now this looks kind of complicated as a slide. These are all these different illnesses pointing to, or insulin resistance pointing to all these different illnesses. Ultimately, insulin resistance is what we would refer to as high blood sugar levels. So insulin is a hormone that your pancreas makes, and your insulin levels go high when you have a lot of glucose in your bloodstream, basically. But that's not just sugar. That can be sugar. It can be carbohydrates. So it could be stuff like breads, granola bars, rice, pasta, cereals, bananas, potatoes, frozen pizzas. All of that stuff is essentially sugar in your bloodstream by the time it boils down. And if you eat enough of that, and or you are very genetically sensitive to carbohydrates and you don't do well in them, you gain weight easily, you crave them, you're always hungry, you become eventually what's known as insulin resistant. So your body is not able to produce or effectively use insulin the way it should to lower your blood sugar levels. And the most common expression we'll see of this will be a spare tire, weight around the midsection, fatty liver, you'll see high blood pressure, you'll see problems with your cholesterol issues, you will see eventually pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the connection between the more extreme case of insulin resistance, which is pre-diabetes and diabetes, and how that affects your risk for neurological disorders like depression, anxiety, but not just those, but bipolar, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, motor neuron disease, and so on. So at a glance, you would say, well, of course, you're going to have a higher risk of depression and anxiety if you have, say, for example, type 2 diabetes. But that doesn't explain an explosion in schizophrenia and bipolar when you become type 2 diabetic. So if we look at the mental health rates in general population, this is Ireland, 2019. The prevalence of depression in 2019 in Ireland is about 4%, or was about 4%. It hasn't grown too much, actually. It's not quite 5% now as of 2022. And And if we look at the prevalence of schizophrenia, I just want you to remember these two numbers: depression, 4%, schizophrenia, 0.4%. So I'm not saying all mental illnesses are the same, but it looks very like there's a lot of evidence to support that they all have a similar pathology or a similar root cause, we'll say. So depression is 4%. So 4 people in 100 have depression of general population, and 0.4 have schizophrenia. Now, if you have high blood sugar levels, depression goes up to 11.5%. So again, you might say, well, you have type 2 diabetes, you've probably gained weight, you've probably been told that you're high risk of heart disease. So now you're going to be, obviously you're going to be down in yourself and you're dealing with that illness, but that might explain a slight uptick in depression. But it doesn't explain why you now have a 25-fold increased risk of schizophrenia. So your chances, remember, of having schizophrenia in the general population with or without diabetes, this is just everyone, 0.4%. It's less than one in 250. Now, that becomes 1 in 10. 1 in 250 to 1 in 10 when your blood sugar levels are high. If you have type 2 diabetes, there's a 13% prevalence of schizophrenia. Very rare in general population, 13% of those with type 2 diabetes. And look at all the other ones. So active psychosis, so you're going through psychotic episodes of one expression or another, about 11%. Neurotic disorders and personality disorders like bipolar, nearly 10%. Depression, nearly 12%. Other mental disorders, and so on. So there's a clear connection between the two. Now, you might say, well, then, if that's the case, surely a huge proportion of people with schizophrenia would also have bipolar, and they do. So if we look at the prevalence of type 2 diabetes, remember, type 2 is massively underdiagnosed. That's very clear. There's at least double the same amount of people out there undiagnosed with pre and type 2 diabetes as there are formerly diagnosed, and some people would argue much more. Type 2 prevalence is about, depending on the paper, 15 to 25% in patients with schizophrenia. Now, if you look at the general population, the reason I've highlighted the age group 50 to 59 is it's quite unusual for type 2 diabetes to present in childhood or even in your 20s, early 30s. If you look at when it manifests, it's typically longer term damage that expresses itself as type 2 diabetes. So it takes a while for the pancreas to have to give up, depending on how sensitive you are to carbs and sugar. And if we look, by the time we work in the NHS, we work with thousands now at this stage of patients who have type 2 diabetes. And if you look at the average age of the patients we work with, it's always between 50 and 62, 63, because that's the time that you're most likely to be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, to gain a lot of weight and so on, because that's generally when the pancreas starts to struggle. So, you're talking 20, 30, 40 years of sustained high blood sugar levels before the pancreas actually says, I'm done, I'm on holidays here, lads. And that's what we call pre or type 2 diabetes. And the schizophrenic group had a 50% prevalence of type 2 diabetes. 50%, 1 in every 2 patients with schizophrenia between the age of 50 and 59 also have type 2 diabetes. So there's a massive overlap between high blood sugar levels, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, bipolar, schizoaffective disorder, everything. It just goes right across. And it's understood now that the shared mechanism is high blood sugar levels cause inflammation and damage to a part of your cell known as the mitochondria, the energy production part of your cell. So your cells get damaged from high blood sugar levels, and ultimately that affects the brain, because the brain, even though it makes up less than, I think it's like 2% of your body weight, uses 25% of your body's energy. It's a real energy, high energy demanding organ, as organs go. So again, patients with schizophrenia, if you look at their rates of type 2 diabetes, at 40, it's up at nearly 18%. General population, it's like 10%. And it's twice the level, type 2 diabetes at twice the level that it is for those who don't have type 2 diabetes. Now, the reason I'm using type 2 diabetes as an example is that type 2 diabetes is an extreme manifestation of what high blood sugar levels end up being. So what's really interesting about this is when I went into the literature, I saw exactly the same thing in that high blood sugar levels, your blood sugar levels going high from eating carbohydrate and sugar, or being too sensitive to it because you have that genetic, what we call polymorphism or proclivity for likelihood of ending up with diabetes or weight around the midsection. So you're sensitive to carbs genetically. So you either eat too many carbs and sugar, or you're just genetically very sensitive to them. And we see that having high blood sugar levels confers at least a 2x all the way up to a 20x increased risk of all of these neurological disorders. So depression, anxiety, bipolar, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, Huntington's disease, all of them, every single one of them have high blood sugar levels will like double, triple, and 10x your risk of all of those. So why is it? Well, it's at the root cause of all of those is a couple of different things. This is where I get just a little bit technical just for a second. So you have, let me stop sharing this. So what you have with all of those illnesses that we talk about, you have a couple of shared mechanisms. If you have type 2 diabetes or high blood sugar levels, if you let your blood sugar levels trend high over time, you've decreased energy getting to the brain. The reason you have that is because your body can run fine without becoming dysfunctional on sugar and carbohydrate for a certain period of time. This is the reason people say, I could eat whatever I wanted to until I hit my 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever, insert the decade there. Because your pancreas will work fine. You know, it's new. It's just out of the factory when you're born. And by the time you hit your teenage years, by the time you get into your 20s, it's still pretty resilient. But after a lifetime of, you know, processed food, refined sugars, carbohydrates, seed oils, and stuff that can damage your pancreas, alcohol, and so on, you end up getting to a point that it basically gets tired and can kind of half shut down. And when it starts to slow down in production of insulin or not be able to make or use insulin effectively, what you tend to see happening is the spare tire in the midsection, blood pressure goes up, you have energy levels that are just not what they used to be, and you put that down to old age. And in actual fact, at my age, so I'm in my mid-40s, and you should be bursting full of energy. And if you're not, there's likely something going on metabolically. So the first thing that all of these conditions have in common, all of those neurological disorders and is high blood sugar levels, is impaired energy metabolism. So your body not being able to produce energy effectively. And that's ultimately from running on sugar as a fuel source and your body not being able to use it effectively anymore. Which is why when you switch from a high carb, high sugar diet over to a ketogenic, so a ketogenic diet would be very low carb, high in healthy fats and so on. You could call it low carb. A more extreme version is keto. People talk about carnivore. There's paleo diets. There's primal blueprint. There's loads of different versions of them. My preferred type version of it is like a low carb, healthy kind of a low carb, whole food diet. Your energy goes just through the roof compared to what you were used to. And we get patients in their 60s, 70s, and 80s saying, I can't believe I've gone 30 or 40 years not knowing that, you know, being tired every day is not normal. You know, getting to a point that you just have loads of energy from morning to evening, or at least that it's stable, at a minimum that it's stable. You're not getting that slump, the 3 p.m. slump that the food industry love us to think is normal. So that's the first thing we have in common with all of those. High blood sugar levels will cause energy issues over a long period of time, which when we see it in the brain, it's present in Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, depression, and anxiety. And depending on what part of the brain it affects, we put different labels on it. So if it affects your mood and your enthusiasm for doing things and your outlook on life, we call it depression. If it affects your prefrontal cortex and your amygdala, the fear center in the front of the brain, for example, we might call it anxiety. If it affects your motor neuron function, we might call it something else like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. So we name the disease based on the set of symptoms and the part of the brain that it affects. Where in actual fact, there's an argument that you could make that you could say that this is an energy metabolism issue that stems predominantly from diet in most people, and it's presented as. So there's a great book by Dr. Chris Palmer called Brain Energy. I will give you a warning if you're thinking about getting the book. It is complicated. It's heavy. But he makes the argument that we should call all of these diseases brain energy metabolism issues presenting as. So brain energy metabolism presenting as schizophrenia, brain energy metabolism issues presenting as anxiety, presenting as depression, and so on. That at their root, they're all essentially what we call mitochondrial brain energy production issues presenting in different parts of the brain and with a different set of symptoms. But ultimately, they're all interlinked by that metabolic dysfunction. Another thing they all have in common is inflammation and oxidative stress. So, I mean, it's no wonder if you look up any research study and you look at areas of the world that don't have processed food, you look at remote tribes around the world, not only do they not have much chronic disease like high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver, obesity, they've little or none of that compared to us in the Western world. They have very, very, very low rates of anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar. Now, I'm not going to say none because you can get a head trauma and end up with schizophrenia. There's multiple different ways that you can end up with those symptoms. But the rates of all of those conditions are borderline non-existent in remote tribes around the world. So this is not to say that the mitochondrial view or the brain energy view of metabolic diseases is not to say that, oh, it's just your diet, change your diet and you'll be fine. There are multiple ways that you can damage your mitochondria. You can do it by taking way too many drugs, particularly things like cocaine and kind of heavier drugs in particular. You can also do it with cannabis, interestingly enough. So there's a cannabis-induced psychosis where you can ruin your mitochondria and end up with schizophrenia from having too much cannabis over the years. Heavy users, there's a not insignificant rate of psychosis and schizophrenia in cannabis users as well. Alcohol will do the same thing. Chemical pollutants will do the same thing. Sedentary lifestyles increase your risk of all those mental health disorders. And an inflammatory, like, kind of low fat, very high sugar processed food diet, pizza, ice cream, cereals, breads, all that sort of stuff will increase your risk of mental illness as well. And what all of those things have in common is that they affect your brain energy production. So if you want to do more research on this, I'm sorry, let me just go back to sharing this for 2 seconds. Share my screen, window. Okay, the other thing I wanted to show you here is that, so we know now that carbs and sugar inflame your brain. So foods that we used to think were great, if overconsumed, and particularly on top of an already processed food diet, rice, pasta, cereal, potatoes. Now, these are the kind of ones that shock people, but the ones beyond this are very obvious, like pizza, ice cream, granola bars, 99s, smoothies, all the sort of high sugar smoothies, iced coffees with like 17 spoons of sugar from McDonald's. All of these foods inflame your brain. That's not up for debate anymore. We know that. And the opposite to that fuel source, where we can provide a fuel source that actually does the opposite, that's anti-inflammatory by blocking inflammatory pathways, and that produces an energy source that the brain loves to thrive on, is ketones. Now, ketones are an energy source that your body will produce in the absence of sufficient levels of glucose. So basically what that means, if you eat less carbs, if you cut bread, cereal, rice, pasta out of your diet, or eat vastly less, and you just eat meat, eggs, cheese, low sugar berries like strawberries, blackberries, blueberries to a lesser degree, raspberries, and above ground fruits. So just look up the basics of a low carb or ketogenic diet. Your brain will produce ketones. Your body produces ketones anyway, but it'll produce higher levels of ketones, which are anti-inflammatory and provide a practically unlimited supply of fuel for your brain. Now, your brain does require some glucose, but you don't have to eat glucose. Your body will produce it without food through something known as gluconeogenesis, where excess protein is converted into glucose to supply the brain and other internal organs' energy demands. And this is why the ketones or ketogenic diet is now being studied. It's been studied for over 100 years for pediatric epilepsy, because up to 40% of kids, when they're put on a ketogenic diet at 7, 8, 9, 10 years of age with epilepsy, will have either a reduction in seizures or the seizures will stop altogether. So this is a low carb or ketogenic diet. And there are numerous studies now at the moment looking at fasting and ketogenic diets as a potential wonder treatment for schizophrenia, bipolar, Alzheimer's, ALS, motor neuron disease, depression, and anxiety. So all of these symptoms of mental illness, because if you reduce down the amount of carbohydrate and sugar, you reduce the inflammation, you reduce the oxidative stress, you provide an alternative fuel source, and you repair that energy production part of your cell known as the mitochondria. So that's a little bit on the science. I just wanted to give you a brief download on that. And also, if all of this stuff is true, then surely, if at the root cause of most mental illness, and I'm saying if because it's not something we can claim is definitely true, but it certainly looks to be the case, and there's an overwhelming body of data to support this, both mechanistically and from a study point of view now starting to emerge. If this is the case, if carbohydrate and sugar and the processed food diet is driving it, and lifestyle stuff like smoking and alcohol, if it's driving these damages to mitochondria, then surely putting someone on a diet that optimizes your mitochondria, which is a low carb or ketogenic diet, would improve mental health. Now, this study should make you go away from this talk thinking, holy crap, there is, what sort of a world am I living in that this study exists and nobody is talking about it? So if you got a drug, and this is not an over, this is really is a fair statement. If you had a drug that improved depressive symptoms, didn't get rid of depression, improved depressive symptoms by 10%, mark my words, I know from reading literature over the last 15 years, it would be a blockbuster. Every doctor would be told about it at a seminar. It'd be the highest selling drug in every doctor's surgery around the world. It'd be the most prescribed for mental illness. It'd be the go-to drug. Look how much SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, look how much they're prescribed. Every second person is on them. Yet if you look at the literature, there's evidence in some studies that they're not a whole lot better than placebo. Now, I'm not saying stop taking your antidepressants. I was on antidepressants for a long time myself. I've struggled with mental health stuff and I have no problem saying it. I no longer take them, but you look at the literature and you go, geez, they're not a whole lot better than placebo. Now, if you're taking them and they work for you, for the love of God, keep taking them. Do whatever it takes to get out of the hell that is mental health. But, if you had a drug that had a 20% improvement, not a 1 or 2% like you see with antidepressants, then it would sell everywhere. Yet this study exists. Can a ketogenic diet improve symptoms of serious mental illness? This was done in an inpatient facility with 28 patients in France who had bipolar, major depressive disorder that wasn't improving with medication, and schizophrenia. Now, after 12 weeks of just feeding these patients nothing but ketogenic foods, so taking carbs out of their diet and giving them, broccoli, avocado, steak, cheese, strawberries and cream, dark chocolate, all that sort of ketogenic based foods. So 75 to 80% fat, moderate protein, 15 to 20%, and almost no carbohydrate. 43%. So this is not an improvement. It's not like 43% of those with schizophrenia had less auditory or visual hallucinations. 43% of schizophrenic patients stopped having schizophrenia. 43% of those with major depression no longer had depression 12 weeks later. 43% on average of those with bipolar no longer met the diagnostic criteria for bipolar. That is wild. That's 1 in 2 patients with schizophrenia, bipolar, or depression no longer had schizophrenia, bipolar, and depression, respectively, at the end of a 12-week period. 64% had to reduce their medications or stop them. 96% of patients lost weight. And symptoms improved in 100% of the patients. 28 out of 28 of the patients got better. Now, show me a drug that can do that. That's the power of food, and also speaks very strongly to back up the idea, mechanistically at least, and now in a study form, that at the root cause of many of these mental illnesses may be a energy metabolism problem in the brain that's caused for the most part by food, or at least can be corrected by optimizing your mitochondria with food. So guys, if you're listening to this and you have depression or anxiety, I've suffered with depression and anxiety on and off over the years. I had a generalized anxiety disorder in my early 20s. Took medication for it, was on and off antidepressants for 10 years, came across a ketogenic diet, and thank God, don't suffer with any mental illness anymore. Please consider either speaking to us in conjunction with the treatment that you're already seeking, in conjunction and with your GP's oversight, speaking to us or someone qualified in the field to look at a ketogenic diet as an intervention. And if you're listening to us and you're one of our corporate customers, which you must be if you're listening to this, reach out to me if you want a hand in getting on this way of eating, and I can get you up and running on the Ready Care program. I'm really passionate about helping people with mental health where I can. All right, guys, I leave it at that for the moment. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen to today's seminar or podcast. And have a good day. Enjoy the weather. And we'll see you in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.